Living Legends. We're at at the El Reno Historical Society, and I'm interviewing the Vice President of the Canadian County Historical Society, Mr. Jack Reuter. That's Reuter. And Mr. Reuter is a young man historically, but he comes from a family that dates back into the early days of Oklahoma. In addition to his personal interest in history, his own activity in the Historical Society, and his collection of historical memorabilia, Mr. Reuter also has many of the stories that he recalls that his father and his grandfather told him about the early days of this area. Mr. Reuter, to begin with, you're Jack Reuter, is that correct? Well, Jack, to begin with, why don't you tell us about where you were born, who your father was, your mother, and who your grandfather was, and to properly date them, tell where they were born and where they came from. If your grandfather made the run or is in the very early stock, well, you can give his early background.
Well, I was born near Houston, which is southwest here, about 10 miles. It used to be a little town there, Houston community.
How do you spell it?
Heaston.
Where is that specifically?
Well, it's 4 south and 7 west of El Reno. There's a little community there, had a post office, a little bit of a town there. At the time I was born right east of there a mile, and my father lived there, and my grandfather lived a mile north of there. It's a little, all left there now is a church, a non-denominational church that they still have. My father was born in 1894, and then my grandfather, of course, come into this country from Kansas, and it was after the run. He didn't make the run, but he come in and bought a farm after the run, and Fred Reuter, and then my grandfather on my mother's side was J.C. Lovins, and he moved in that community in 1911. He was born in Paducah, Kentucky, and he was on his own when he was very small, probably 9 or 10 years old, working back through that country down into Missouri, and made his living when he was just a boy cutting ties for railroad, and lived over into Kellyville, Oklahoma. He claims that he saw Frank and Jesse James one time come into a store over there in early days.
How do you tell about him?
He's probably one of the people in this community that knew him. He was quite a storyteller, my grandfather, and he loved the outdoors probably better than any man I ever saw. He could walk into the woods where in 5 minutes see more than most people would all day long. He was that type of person. He loved to hunt and fish, and even up till when he was 75 years old, you'd go squirrel hunting with him. He'd get more squirrels than you would. He, of course, lived on a farm and farmed and loved to hunt and fish. I think I've listened to many a story that he's told. He lived with us in later years, and well, he told me stories every night when I went to bed till I went to sleep.
Recall any of these stories?
Oh, he talks about Petree's ranch down here on the South Canadian River. How they used to go down in that country and go fishing along in the river there on the South Canadian, between Kettle Jake's Crossing and the crossing below it, downriver from it. Catch so many fish that they couldn't hardly pull them up out of there in wagons. They'd have a teaming wagon, and they'd catch fish and clean them, put them in barrels, salt them down, and bring them home. He tells stories about in the wintertime making a living trapping skunks and about the early day, he'd show you where the buffalo wallows was. I know you'd see a buffalo wallow in a pasture, and he'd tell you what it was. A lot of people say, well, what is that? And he'd tell you, explain to you, and why the buffalo used it to get flies off of them.
Tell about a buffalo wallow, what it looks like, what it's for.
Well, if you out in these pastures that haven't been worked, you take in this country where the ground hadn't been worked, you'll find a spot, a low spot in a grass pasture that hadn't been disturbed, and maybe it'll be 20 foot across. Some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller, but as a rule, they'll be about 1.5 feet, 2 feet deep, and they're just round, and you wonder, well, what made that round hole, and just a dip out in the flat prairie, and it was, of course, Grandpa and all the early day men in this country would tell you that the buffalo made it. They'd use it as a wallow. In dry weather, it'd be full of dust and sand, where they keep wallowing in it to get flies off of it. And whenever it got wet, it'd get water in it, and they'd still wallow in it, get mud on it, get flies off. So you'll see evidence of that all over this country. I guess a lot of people see it and don't realize what it is. Maybe run through one, you drive across the pasture after rain, a lot of times you get stuck in one of them, and you wonder, why that hole's there. A lot of people don't take time to look and wonder or understand why it's there. I'm the curious type. I look for arrowheads, and I look for campsites, and I have found quite a few places where Indians camp. If you take time, and I think my grandfather taught me this, probably more than anybody, he'd see a robin, or he'd see many different things, and people today are in such a big hurry, they run across stuff. I went arrowhead hunting with people that they'd walk over arrowheads, and you follow right behind them and find something. We don't take time to look and inspect the stuff that we walk across.
How do you identify these Indian campsites?
This is kind of a simple thing when you really get down to thinking about it. I have some beads here that I picked up in this area up there, well on the place where I live, on top of that hill. There's probably 20 acres there where Indians would camp. One thing you look for, and Grandpa always said, if you're walking through the woods and you run across a place that you think you'd like to build you a home there, he said probably an Indian thought of this 100 or 200 or 300 years before this. It was just a perfect place to camp. Another thing you have to look for is it had to have water somewhere close by. There had to be a spring or a creek that run water, or the river. In the early day, there wasn't no wells, so you have to look for water, and then you have to look for a spot up out of the water where it's flat and level, where it'd be. If you think it'd be a nice place to build a home, well, probably an Indian thought so many years ago. They camped in the winter down out of the wind, down lower behind bank or high bank or something where it'd be out of the north wind. In the summer, they camped up on top where it was out of the way of the mosquitoes, I think. That's my theory anyway, where it was cooler, and a lot of times in this area, a lot of people today, you can't find an arrowhead in Canadian County, but I've proved wrong several times. There is arrowheads here, and George Winter, he hunts for arrowheads, and it's a fascinating thing. You got to have a little imagination when you find one, and you got to be looking, and you got to pay attention, and why it was here, and so forth.
Can you discuss the type of arrowheads you have here in Canadian County?
We read arrowheads that probably were used on maybe killing a rabbit, stunning him maybe. Maybe they shot an arrow without an arrowhead at all on it, with this wood blunted on the end to there. Some we find the larger one, the smaller one. I think probably like we do today. If you're going squirrel hunting, you might take a .22 rifle, small, and if you're going deer hunting, you take a big shell. So I think the Indian was doing this 300 or 400 years ago. They feel like that the longer the point is, in other words, it was used for a spear rather than an arrowhead. Feel like that the arrow wasn't invented, or the bow, until about 500 BC. And but the different types of points you find different colors. Flint is not native to this county, so when you're out looking and you find a piece of flint, somebody has carried it in here from either down in Texas or in Arkansas, Arizona, or somewhere around this area, because flint is not native to this area. So this is the way your first clue to camp or a place where there's making them finding pieces of flint or flint chips.
You're a collector of barbed wire. Why don't you discuss it a little bit and the important part that the barbed wire played in the settlement of the Oklahoma and the West?
The barbed wire, I started collecting that several years ago. I didn't have no books on it, but I'd see it and it'd be interesting. It'd be different. I'd wonder what it was. Finally found a few books on it. McAllister wrote a book. He'd been collecting for a good many years down in Texas. But barbed wire, it's the most fascinating thing when you get down to it. Barbed wire was invented along about 1866, or right after the Civil War. It wasn't so important maybe back in the East, in that part of the country. They had timber and they had rocks and so forth. They could make a fence out of wood or a rail or something. But when you got into the West, in the plains, there wasn't near enough timber or rocks or anything to make a fence out of. It was very difficult to keep cattle within your area, so you had to herd them or something. And finally, they invented barbed wire, and it was a success, no less. And actually, there's been very little change in it since it was invented. They patented it, and it caught on real quick in the West, and it's what tamed the West, or what really made the West settle down, because they got it fenced in, then they could handle their cattle and so forth. The fascinating thing about it is that they started making it. If you could change the pattern, another guy's pattern, at least 10%, then you could make wire. Many people changed it just a little and made wire. Therefore, we have so many different kinds of wire. Some of it made it like bootleg whiskey. In other words, they made wire and sold it till they got caught and put out of business. But when you get to checking areas, and of course, me wandering around hunting and fishing and looking for arrowheads, I run across different kinds of wire, and consequently went to collecting it, and probably got about 200 different kinds of wire. And I've probably found about 80 different kinds in Canadian counties in this period of time, from 1866 up to about 1900. We had the Cheyenne Arapaho Indian Reservation here, and they was trying to fence it, and the government bought wire and gave it to the Indian if he would use to fence his area or the reservation. And consequently, some of the government wire, old timers call it government wire. Some of them call it Indian wire. Actually, it's called buckthorn, made in 1881, and what they call government wire. The majority of these say that's exactly like the old original wire. There hadn't been no improvement as far as maybe a little bit in the metal. I doubt that, because the wire made back then is still good wire.
I guess when you get down to it, you think, what can you add to our money?
Well, they're making a little different kind of wire. I have one piece here on board that's plastic that comes from Sweden, and maybe it's an improvement. It don't look like it to me, but it don't look like it's any better than the other, and I bet you it won't last as long, because the old galvanized wire is getting close to 100 years old, and you very seldom find a piece of it that's rusty. So,
you're also a collector of guns.
yeah.
Why don't you, and I understood that you've given talks on the guns at one of the Western studies, why don't you tell us that story, the basic story that you've given?
Well, as I say, I collect old guns, and I've got a collection that actually just takes you back in history. You go back a little over 200 years, back to about 1740. I started collecting about 20 years ago, and of course my grandfather, he was a good shot with a pistol and a rifle and a shotgun, and he didn't believe in this lot of fancy stuff. He had a pistol, and whenever he shot it, he used both hands. He intended to hit what he shot at, and he generally did. These guns, and I started collecting around in this part of the country, and picked up some of the old guns that they used. This, at first, you pick up one, you don't know what it is, you go to studying it, and consequently you start studying history. You know, I always did like history, but you find an old gun, and you find out when it was made, and then you try to find out what era it was used in, and by who, and why, and so forth. So consequently, you study history. I have guns that date back to about 1740 and 1750, and then into the Revolutionary War. Then, at this point in American history, we didn't make guns. We wasn't in the manufacturing business during this period of time, except we finally, the frontiersmen they was using European rifles that weren't too accurate. They didn't have a long range, and they weren't too accurate. And so some of the gunsmiths that come over, they wanted them to build them a gun that was accurate. In other words, they're standing here with an old rifle that comes from Europe that's a big caliber, and the Indian's standing off out here at 80 yards with a bow and arrow, and he was actually could shoot further than you and was more accurate than you were, so you was at much of a disadvantage, because it took you a long time to load that old gun, and that Indian could he could have 2 or 3 arrows in the air at one time, and there you was trying to load that old gun. I started studying this, and they invented the Kentucky rifle in this country. They call it Kentucky rifle, actually made in Pennsylvania. But at the time that and this is an American invention, and the first gun that was made and invented in America, it was the most accurate rifle in the world, and still very accurate rifle. We shoot them. I belong to a club. I belong to the National Muzzle-Loading Rifle Association of America. There's about 10,000 people in the United States belong to this, and we shoot these old rifles. We trying to preserve this part of the history of this country, and the first gun that was made in this country. And we shoot them and love to shoot them. And in fact, I killed a squirrel with this little rifle here the other day, and it was probably the biggest thrill. I was more thrilled by killing a squirrel with a Kentucky rifle than I ever was with killing a deer with a modern rifle. There's something about it.
Did you go to this muzzle-loading convention in Dearborn last week?
No, I went to Tulsa 2 weeks ago and shot in a match at Penn.
Talked to someone who had just come back to be there when he got the national meet.
Yeah, Don and Jerry went up to Friendship, Indiana to a national meet here last month. And, but I've gradually collected a few guns down through the area that were used by Indians, by cowboys, and why they used them, and why the Indian would kill you for that rifle that you was carrying, and why he'd slip up on you and wanted that repeater, that lever action, as a period after the Civil War. The Civil War, probably more guns were invented in the Civil War than any other time in the period of American history. More improvement, or we call it improvement, repeaters, the shell, the cartridge gun. Then after the Civil War, well, we had the finish up of the Indian War, and an Indian would he'd kill you quick for that rifle you was carrying.
This friend of mine told me that whenever there was a fault, a failure to shot, that there was that they immediately sent the gun back, and that you couldn't eject or anything. You'd have to send it back and have to go through some very special safety precautions. What are the reasons for these additional safety precautions on the muzzleloader?
The muzzleloader used black powder, and it's a flintlock, and it's got a prison and a pan. You dump the powder down the barrel, and you put a patch on it and a ball, and you push it down. There's a little pan on the side of the barrel, back to back, in front of it, on top of the lock. You put powder in it, and when you pull the trigger, the flint hits the prison and drops a spark or two into this little pan. It catches on fire, and then burns into a hole, into the barrel, and then it goes off. It takes quite a while to tell about it, but actually it happens normally in about 5/10 of a second. You get a slight delay, but if it don't go off, you're standing there wondering if maybe that's burning real slow into that barrel, and maybe it's going to go off. We call it a hang fire. And if you pull the trigger and it don't go off, you have to be very careful, because you keep aiming, because it may go off. And this consequently is why the safety precaution on it. We've been hunting with these things, and they started the first muzzleloading club of our area in 1934, and started shooting them. There hasn't been a serious or fatal accident with muzzleloading guns in the National Muzzleloading Rifle Association in this century. While there's people get killed with guns every day accidentally, but the muzzleloading, you have to know something about the gun in order to shoot it. A modern rifle, you got a box of shells, you just put it in there and shoot it. A kid don't understand what's in it, and he maybe don't understand how powerful it is or how dangerous it is. But if he learns to shoot a muzzleloader, he has to know that he's got to put powder in it. How much powder? If he's hunting squirrels, he might not put but 20 grains or a small charge. If he's going to hunt something bigger, he puts a little more. Every time you make this shell, so you have to, it's actually make reloading, it's a reloading piece is what it is, because you load it every time. So we encourage the younger generation to learn about this. Then they know something about a gun, and they're not likely to get hurt or kill somebody with this gun.
Did your grandfather or your father tell you any stories dealing with weapons that might...
Now, my father had one old shotgun, and he didn't really care about guns at all. He was busy making a living for his family. And for years, I didn't even know whether he could shoot a gun or not. But I never will forget one day, we was shucking corn down the cornfield. And boy, the quail was as thick as hair on dog's back. And he said, well, after dinner, we'll bring that old shotgun and we'll get a mess of quail for supper. Well, we come by there, and that old thing without shotgun, and he shot into a bunch of quail, must have killed a dozen of them, and we brought him in and ate him. And he didn't hunt hardly at all, and I loved to hunt. And he had one little old 22 rifle and one shotgun. Well, you wonder why I collected guns, that I finally started collecting, because my grandfather on my father's side, he loved to hunt. My father, though, one day, I didn't think he'd shoot very well, so I was out shooting this little 22, and he come out there and he took one of these little medicine bottles and threw it up in the air and shot it with his 22 rifle. And I couldn't imagine how in the world he could do it. But then he told me how to do it and showed me how to do it. And I learned to do this whenever I was pretty young. And I could outshoot most kids in the neighborhood, not because of me, but my father had showed me how to do this. I could have somebody throw up a bottle and I could hit it with a 22 in the air. And this was a fascinating thing to me because I could do it.
Did your grandfather tell you any stories dealing with any of the early day personalities in there?
Oh, he worked for different people, and he talked about Petree's ranch down here, which is a large area. And he told stories about how they got started, and I don't know whether I can repeat them or not. You have still some of the people living that, of course, the old man Petree is dead, and Mrs. Petree is dead, and the foreman that used to be down there. There are a lot of people, of course, you take people that have got money and rich, they always claim that they finagled somehow. But anyhow, he had a ranch down there. My grandpa knew him well, and he said he got cattle out of Texas and stuff. There's another ranch up the river, the Child Ranch, and it's still pretty well intact. The two daughters of the old man Child, the daughter and the son, still own this ranch, and he told stories about going over there and helping round up cattle. There's several thousand acres in it. They would go over there and round up cattle, help them round up and brand cattle and vaccinate, and they would feed you to go over there. If you'd go over and help them, well, they'd always feed you real good. I don't recall ever getting paid for going over there, but it was kind of like people didn't have things to go to, so this was a kind of a get-together. As you worked, that people got together and helped them ranchers round up these cattle, and they would help them drive them to market. He said that they'd drive them to El Reno, and he said they'd drive them right through town, through the bottom down here, through Colored Town. He said that why they did, I didn't know, but they'd drive them right through the colored part of town. He said doggone steers and stuff would maybe knock porch off of the house. You know, you'd have 200 or 300 heads going right down through there toward those yards down in there. And they'd jump on the porch back there, knock posts down, knock fence down. So evidently they didn't have too much regard for those people in that early day. And they did this. They drove cattle. Instead of hauling, there wasn't no way of hauling cattle. And he said they always drove cattle. They'd get them fat, and then they'd drive them slow so they wouldn't run the fat off of them. But they'd drive them. Then they'd put them on box cars or on cattle cars. And they'd either go to Fort Worth with them or Kansas City with them. And they had if they were your cattle, well, you'd have a free pass to ride. And some of your groups go with you and ride up and sell cattle and then come back. He tells different stories about different people. John Welder, on this place I live on, he said that John had a big barn down there and he dealt with horses. He had a lot of horses and cattle. He would buy cattle all over the country. He'd go country in a team and wagon. No, he tells stories of cattle in the early days coming up through this country. I know, of course, Irwin Penrod out here is still alive, and his father made a run. He tells about making these cattle drives, and he said you could hear longhorn cattle coming up this trail for miles away. Said you hear their horns hitting together. It sounded awful unusual to me, but when they'd have 2,000 to 3,000 head in a bunch, I guess, and them longhorns up there, he said you could actually hear this. His father made the run, and him and his brother herded cattle in this country for a good many years, around 1,000 head of cattle, and him and his brother would herd these cattle before fences were put up all through this country north of here, from Darlington here, west of Calumet, up towards Okarche in this area. His father, of course, sold cattle to the agency to furnish for the Indians. Wasn't no buffalo, so they had to have something. Irwin can tell you many stories about this that are most fascinating. I think Irwin now is about 81. And I'd really like to get you to talk to him because you can listen to him. And he actually seen this stuff. He's seen, well, the oxen used carrying with these wagons, pulling these wagons. Many times you see oxen instead of horses or mules. They claimed the oxen could pull a tremendous amount of weight, and they could live off the land, so to speak. You didn't have to carry so much food and oats and stuff for that oxen. You could let him out to graze. You could leave his yoke on him and let him off to graze, and then hook him back up again. He tells many stories about this. I know Irwin was telling me a story that happened just out here on North Canadian, up the river from Darlington. Said that the Indians in this country buried their dead. But he said one day he come riding up the river, and there was a cottonwood tree there, and there was a dead Indian up in this tree. He was up on a little rack in this tree, and his horse was, they killed his horse, and he was at the bottom of the tree. And I said, well, why was he up the tree? And he said he must have been one of the northern Sioux or something. He said they didn't bury him there. They didn't bury him. They put him up on a rack or above the ground. And he showed me the tree. It's out here on the river, a big cottonwood tree. And he said that's the tree. That's where that Indian was. And he said he must not have been a Cheyenne or a Arapaho, or they would have buried him. So whatever the story on it, it kind of makes you wonder. And I have found